Our text this morning, as we continue in our series called Crescendo, which is living with open hearts in every stage of life. Our text this morning comes from Exodus 18, and I'm going to actually start a verse earlier than I told them, so it's not their fault that it's not there. Starting in verse 7. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and then went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they had met along the way and how the Lord had saved them. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. He said, "Praise be to the Lord who rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly." Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. The next day, Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge, while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses answered him, "Because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and instructions." Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them his decrees and instructions, and show them the way they are to live and how they are to behave. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter because they will share it with you. If you do this, and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied." Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. He chose capable men from all Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves. Then Moses sent his father-in-law on his way, and Jethro returned to his own country. Please join me in prayer. Bless us this day, O Lord, with vision. May this place be a sacred place, a telling space, where heaven and earth meet. Amen. I wonder if you can think of a time when someone who has no positional or positional authority over you spoke into your life in such a way that it greatly changed how you did things. I think we all, hopefully, many of us, have someone who is able to watch what we do and to offer suggestions, and that we are humble enough to hear those suggestions. Last week, we spent our time in Psalm 71, and we particularly focused on what I would call Psalm 71's legacy verse, which part of says, "Until I declare your power to the next generation. And we talked about what it meant to continue to declare what God is doing to the next generation. We talked about what it costs and how it feels to be handed a verdict in decline as we age and people make decisions about our circumstances and make judgments about our worth. This week, I want us to focus and listen to this story because I think it gives us a demonstration of how that works in a flesh and blood person. So we hear this story. Moses and the people have come, and Jethro, his father-in-law, has come and met them, and Moses is catching him up on the story of the people of Israel and what God has been doing since Moses left Jethro's family. And one of the things that I think is fascinating, and I think that is a good lesson for us, because in our culture, particularly I think in church culture, sometimes we have a way of curating our experience of life. Now, everybody does this. People have become billionaires on this whole idea, the socials, where we present curated versions of our life, and we show only usually the best of what happens to us. But you'll notice that the text tells us in those first verses that Moses told Jethro everything that happened, all of it, not just God's rescue, but also the hard parts of the story. Moses told his father-in-law about how God had rescued the Israelites from Pharaoh and the Egyptians, but he also told them about the hardships along the way, which, as you remember the story of Moses leading God's people out of Egypt, there were a few hard spots, were there not? There were some mistakes made along the way. There were some things done that were not great. But Moses resists the urge of glossing over them, and he tells the whole story. I think this can be a model for us, because I think sometimes, perhaps, people are reticent to give us a good hearing of the good news of Jesus because we might tend to present a curated life. I once had a woman in a church that I served. We were doing a leadership exercise. It's kind of a getting to know you thing. And so we were all gathered around this big table, and I asked each person, I gave them a blank sheet of paper, and I asked them to draw out like a graph when they felt closest to God and when they felt furthest away from God in their life story. Like as they went through the seasons of life, when did they feel like God was close? When did they feel like God was absent? And so as we went around the table, people had different versions. Oh, this was when my spouse died. This was when, I first came to Jesus. This is when God showed up for me in this way, so on and so forth. Until we came to one woman who at that time was in her 70s. And her graph looked like a long division sign. She was like, this was my life before I met Jesus at 16, and then it goes up here, and it was a flat line all the way across. And I thought that might be one of the saddest things I had ever seen. Not because I didn't believe that she felt very present to Jesus, but it just seemed to me that wasn't maybe an honest depiction of what life is like. That once we meet Jesus, everything just flows smoothly. It certainly has not been my experience. If that's your testimony, God bless you. But Moses told the whole story. And what happens is that Jethro, the text tells us, was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. And then he said, "Praise be to the Lord who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly. Now I know the Lord is greater than all gods." It's interesting to note that this is the same confession of the widow at Zarephath. It's the same confession as Naaman before he went down into the river to be washed. This is outsider language. This is language of people who have been outside the faith, watching and perhaps hearing the stories, and then when they hear the testimony of how God has shown up, then they know. Now, a couple of other things about what's happening, and it's important to notice as we look at this story. As we read through, we notice a couple things. The first is that after this, then Jethro brings an offering, a burnt offering. And burnt offerings in that culture, when you did a burnt offering, then there most often was a feast that accompanied it. And you'll notice that as they describe the feast, it says that Aaron and all the elders of Israel are at the table. They're all in the room. This is important. We'll come back to it. But I want you to remember that. They aren't a special guest. They aren't tacked on to the story in some other way. They're in the room from the very beginning of the story. So then we move on in the story, and it tells us that Moses, it gives an example of a typical day in the life of Moses as he leads the people of Israel. The text tells us that Moses sat as judge from morning until evening, all day, every day. And as we hear this story, we recognize that Jethro is there, and Jethro is watching. But one of the things that's interesting is Jethro appears to be a man of few words. He observes first and comments later, and he asks penetrating questions. Questions like, "Why do you sit alone?" This isn't a question about burnout. It's not a question about pride. It's a gently asked question to a leader who is in the grind. Why do you sit alone? And the thing that Jethro, I think, is seeing is the overlooked cost. The thing that Moses and the elders apparently are not seeing is that it's wearing him down. And it's wearing the people out because they're all standing there all day waiting on one man to provide judgment for them. And the lesson, I think, here for those doers in the room is that doing everything yourself isn't always humility. Sometimes it's the quiet belief that you're the only one who can do it. I'm going to let that sit for a second. Doing everything yourself isn't always humility. Sometimes it's the quiet belief that only you can be trusted with the task at hand. So then we come after Jethro watches Moses do this all day long. Then he begins to speak into Moses' life. Now you'll notice a couple of things. Jethro has zero standing in the camp. Jethro is not an Israelite. Jethro is not Moses' boss. Jethro isn't a priest of Israel. Jethro isn't even an Israelite. Jethro's authority is entirely earned. It's entirely relational. And it still reshapes a nation. Jethro watches for a full day before he speaks. And when he speaks, it goes straight to the point. Jethro names it very plainly and directly. He looks Moses in the eye and he says, "What you are doing is not good. The task is too heavy for you." Now, there are a number of ways that we can imagine Moses reacting to this. But my sense is that a leader who has been doing what Moses has been doing for all this time probably heard this, and it was balm to his soul. Because somewhere in there, he knew that he couldn't do it, that the load was too heavy, that this was too much. What you are doing is not good. Now, looking at Jethro, I want us, especially those of us in the second half of life, to notice some things that Jethro did. The first, as I've already said, is Jethro watched for a full day before he spoke. Presence before advice. One of the drawbacks, I think, of being an older or a seasoned leader is the temptation to walk into a room, observe for about 2 minutes, and then to speak your wisdom, instead of watching and seeing what's actually happening in the room, and then speaking. Presence before advice. There's an idea that we talked about last week in Psalm 71, verse 16, where the psalmist says, "I will come and proclaim your mighty acts, sovereign Lord. I will proclaim your righteous deeds, yours alone." And I talked a little bit about how the action in this verse is not more striving. It's not another task. It's a vow to keep showing up, to simply be present, and to name what God is doing. That's Jethro's whole posture here. He shows up. Moses and Jethro and their family are reunited, and Jethro puts presence before advice. And then when he has the opportunity, he speaks. He doesn't seek to, in the wisdom that he gives, there are more lessons. You'll notice that he does not try to structure this in such a way that inserts him into the process. He simply names what he sees. This isn't good, not sustainable. Here's an idea. Why don't you appoint men, leaders, to oversee different sizes of groups so that you can spread the work? He suggests a structure that lets Moses keep what's actually his to carry and let go of that never was. And then he does this, and this is brilliant. He says, if God so commands you, no coercion, what you really should do is this, but instead, if God so commands you. One of the temptations I think that we have as we follow Jesus, especially I think the longer we follow Jesus, is to sometimes insert God in a way that's not like this. That goes like, well, God told me, which usually means that whoever you're talking to is supposed to do this thing because God told you. I had a I had a church musician once that came to me, and she kept using that phrase, and every time she used it, it was some task for me to do. And finally, one day, I just looked at her and I said, "That's funny. God didn't tell me that." And we didn't have that conversation anymore. But Jethro says, if God so commands, he invites Moses to hear God's voice in the wisdom that he offers. He doesn't assert himself, he doesn't push, he doesn't demand. He just lays out the plan and says, if God so directs you, you might appoint capable, God-fearing, trustworthy leaders who hate dishonest gain. From your lips, Jethro, to God's ears. Not retirement qualities. These are not qualities of retired people. These are qualities of people who are still engaged in life. They're leadership qualities. God is not done asking things of you because your title changed or your calendar opened up. Jethro could have been like, listen, I'm out of this. Like, I'm the paterfamilias now. I just get to sit back and watch everybody else herd the sheep, and I play whatever version of golf the Midianite version was, and that's all I do. But Jethro remained engaged. He watched, he offered wisdom, and then he let it go. That's the final piece. Jethro gives this idea. Hey, here's a structure you might want to consider. This will make your load lighter and will serve the people better. If God so directs, you might want to do that. And then what does Jethro do? He goes home. And the text tells us that Moses gave heed and did all that he had said. Moses implements the plan. Jethro goes back to the wilderness, to Midian. Here's the takeaways, I think. The point of this chapter, of this story, was never that Jethro gave good advice. It's that Moses actually listened to the wisdom that Jethro offered. Jethro doesn't stay to run the new system. He knows that his time, this is not his, as one person used to always tell me, not my circus, not my monkeys. He knows that this is not his to implement or do. He just offers it as a good plan. He doesn't need credit. He just goes home. This, friends, is a model of healthy eldership, if you will. An elder is one who gives real counsel, who watches, who sees, who offers, and then lets go of the outcome. If we think about last week's sermon in Psalm 71, and the idea of that the second stage of life is not to retreat into the past, but instead to make a home in God, even while others hand down verdicts about us. And instead of listening to those and worrying about those, it's the choice to continue to tell the story that God is telling and to offer to the next generation the wisdom and the experience of life. Jethro just spent this whole story doing exactly that. Jethro was still living his story. He shows up for the family. He greets Moses. He watches. He offers. He allows God to continue telling the story through him. Brothers and sisters, and this is particularly true for those of us in the second half of life, eldership is not a title we earn by outliving people or outlasting people. And it's not a role that becomes yours once your calendar clears. It's two things held together. Staying close enough, long enough to see what a tired leader or leaders cannot see about themselves and being willing to say it without needing to insert yourself into the process or take the credit. It's simply being willing to stay engaged and to stay present and to offer the wisdom that is yours. I will say this in closing. I think our culture and the church is desperate for elders. We are desperate for the generation that went before to speak into our lives in such a way that shares their wisdom. But friends, it means that we have to stay engaged because we can't speak wisdom if we don't have relationship. Jethro maintained the relationship, and that gave him the right to be an elder. So may God make us elders in whatever years He gives us. May God give us eyes to see what needs to be seen, and the courage to say what needs to be said, and the grace to let go of the outcome once we have. Amen.